Tracy and Matt have obviously set the scene and offered a lot of detailed information. What I will try to do is put what they've been saying in a slightly broader context and kind of talk about this question in terms of if you alter the volatile organic compounds which come from the vegetation that is out there in the earth as we look around, does that matter? And then more importantly, to try and fit in with the theme of this particular session, is what are the implications, if any, to public health of that alteration? Tracy kind of talked a little bit about pollination, but pollination is important in two aspects. One is the kind of understanding of the earth as we know it. So, for instance, Charles Darwin, after writing Origin of the Species, turned his attention to understanding pollination. And evolutionary biology and evolutionary theory, which is very important both in academia and also in terms of determining how we might evolve in the future. Pollination's been fundamental to that. But perhaps more importantly in the environment in which we're speaking here today is that bees actually pollinate a whole range of crops, and a world in which we didn't have these would be a world in which we wouldn't really want to live. There's about 1 billion people in the world who go hungry every year, but there's about 1 billion more who are malnourished because of not being able to access the right micronutrients. And here in the University of Southampton, in this building in particular, we know an awful lot about the actual importance of mothers getting access to the right nutritional input to have a long-time beneficial effect on humans throughout the rest of their life course. So therefore, if we imagined a world in which the pollinators were significantly reduced, and I borrowed this slide from a speaker who was here earlier the week, is an American supermarket tried to give an indication to its customers of what the fruit and vegetable shelves would look like, which is what you can see there at the bottom, if the decline that we're seeing in pollinators continues. And therefore, whilst the calorific staple cereals which we all rely on will not be affected, the fruit and vegetables, which we know are extremely important to offering us a good, healthy diet and the implications that has on public health, would be dramatically changed. But those volatile compounds which Tracy kind of mentioned there aren't just important in terms of pollination, they're important in many, many aspects in terms of the daily lives that we live. So for instance, plants produce chemicals from the flowers which we utilise and exploit in terms of perfume and soap and those types of things. They produce volatiles and that from the leaves, which actually structure the whole communities that live around the plant, and they produce a number of chemicals actually into the soil too. We know that about 40% of the global production in the world is lost to pests and diseases, and yet we know that these volatile organic compounds, so here we have a sesquiterpene compound called cisjasmone, which actually tells other plants to switch on their defence systems when they're under attack. So when Prince Charles talks about plants talking to one another or talking nicely to a plant to improve its health, they have their own ways of talking, but it's actually a chemical language that is being used rather than an auditory one. So therefore, this aspect of how the volatile organic compounds from the plant interplay with the wider system is something which is really worth exploring. So we know that these chemicals are very, very important at the sort of subcellular level that we've heard a lot about, but we also know they're very important kind of at an ecosystem level and actually an atmospheric biosphere level, which has very big implications in terms of public health. And I will try to talk you through the kind of interrelationships between some of these as I move forward. So why is it important at the ecosystem service level and ecosystems to you and the public health is that for about 10 or 15 years now, a report came out in 2005, so 10 years ago, from the World Bank, which showed that to have a healthy environment was very important in providing a whole number of services which helped mankind. Some of those are in terms of food, other in terms of culture, social interactions, freedom of choice, etc. And prior to that report, actually people put a value on it. This is one of the most quoted papers in environmental science, so that back in 1997, people tried to put a value on what having a healthy ecosystem would be like. 33 trillion US dollars in 1997, which was actually twice almost the global GMP at that time. So therefore, disruptions, atmospheric pollution, which actually affects these healthy operating ecosystems, can have big economic implications, and people have gone far further than that. So just recently they've been begun to put values on healthy systems, and I know that there are members of the ocean sciences community here at Southampton. They'll probably be very pleased to see that the open ocean is the most valuable ecosystem on planet Earth. But obviously we know a lot about ocean acidification and the effects of climate change, etc. on that. So there is implications there in terms of atmospheric pollution and what it might do to a whole range of ecosystems. So what I hopefully I've tried to just touch on there to kind of put it back into the context of why it matters to you and why it matters perhaps in terms of public health is that we know that plants and their volatile organic compounds are valuable and important, but we also have seen from Tracy's work there that they are affected by pollutants, but interestingly they can also create pollutants. So it's a complex world out there in which some of the problems that we see are actually being driven by the chemicals which come off plants themselves. So therefore, if we're trying to make policy interventions, or we're trying to make decisions, or we're trying to say we should plant loads of trees in Southampton to mop up the particulates that we see, then we have to think very, very carefully about how we would do that. So coming back to this point here, as you can see this complex interplay between the chemicals coming off plants, how that interacts with the atmosphere, and at the same time how it interacts with the communities that live there. And why is it complex? Because basically about 80% of all the products known to mankind come from plants. Some of these are very, very important. Some of the anti-cancer agents come from the yew tree, and a recent anti-malarial compound comes from Artemisia plants. But they're just a few examples of very useful natural products. What we know is that there's 100,000 types of chemical which come from plants. And over 30,000 of those are the sort of terpene compounds that Tracy spoke about. And we've only actually started scratching the surface of what these chemicals are, what they do, and how we might manipulate the systems to our advantage. And what we do know is, the more we're looking at this, is the effects on these whole range of compounds of being exposed to atmospheric pollutants, the sorts of ones that Tracy mentioned there, can either be altered very quickly within minutes of exposure, or some of them take it a little bit longer, but if they're exposed for long periods of time to high pollution levels, they alter their chemistry. So you could say, from what I'm saying there, is that it's really important for us to understand how pollutants are going to affect these compounds, because we know they're important. And from Matt's work earlier, there's a lot of people in cities who say we should grow trees to try and absorb some of the pollutant compounds and some of the particles to move forward. So growing trees can be good, but unfortunately it can depend. So if we look here in the state of Chicago, is what you can see here is that if you look at ozone, particulates, and some of the compounds which are involved with greenhouse gases and as seen as an atmospheric pollutant, we can show that actually, according to how big your tree is, how many dollars per year that tree is worth in terms of removing atmospheric pollutants. We can go one step further than that, and we can look at actually cities across the US, and we can look again in values of how much pollution is being removed in this whole range of American cities. You can see Los Angeles, California is the best place to have trees in terms of the value they contribute in terms of removing these pollutants. So looking at that, you can kind of come to a conclusion quite quickly that actually growing trees would be a very good way to deal with some of the pollutants that we've been discussing earlier. But Tracy spoke a lot about the pollutants in kind of an urbanized environment. Matt kind of alluded to some of the pollutants associated with kind of power generation and that type of thing. And I'm obviously trying to talk here about, okay, so you've got trees, and all of these are producing particulates, gases, and these volatile organic compounds, which is affecting the atmosphere above. And we can go one step further than that, and we can illustrate how these kind of processes at the level of the troposphere, where we're largely operating, can start affecting the stratosphere and therefore global dynamics. So this question about we can regulate something in the UK or whatever starts having little relevance as soon as it starts getting up into the upper atmosphere, and you can start getting global implications happening. Now, some of these are actually beneficial. The Blue Mountains near Sydney is a top tourist result. But why are they called the Blue Mountains? Well, the blue haze that's above those Blue Mountains is a smog. But rather than the smogs of the cities of Beijing that Don Nutbeam spoke about, or London and Paris, this is like a smog that attracts tourists to come and look at it. Why is it slightly different? Because what happens here is that this smog, effectively, is the eucalyptus oils, the volatile organic compounds that come from the eucalyptus trees in that area, interacting with UV radiation and getting scattered by particles within the atmosphere. It's called a me-scattering, which is a physical phenomena, so that you get this blue light forming. So here we have an example of a plant vegetation interacting with UV and particles to create a smog, but a smog which is attractive for people to view. And many people take pictures of the mountain ranges around the world, in which when you have a mountain range which has a lot of trees, they get these blue hues appearing on them, which attracts kind of people to, as tourists, to go and look at it. What's going on there is, well, there's some quite interesting figures. So if we kind of put some numbers on this, which I think is quite interesting. So if we take a forest, a large forest, something like in the state of Pennsylvania, then that emits 3,400,000 kilograms of these chemical compounds that Tracy was talking about in a typical August day. Right? So you can begin to see now that a lot of these compounds going into the atmosphere are kind of a lot of it is coming from a natural system rather than just a man-made system, and that natural system need not always be good. So if we remove methane, which was mentioned earlier, about 1,150 teragrams of carbon per year come from VOCs. In contrast to that, only 142 teragrams of carbon come from anthropogenic sources. So you can see, therefore, why many people, in terms of carbon emissions, start to say, well, actually, the man-made contribution is only about 1/10 of what's actually being emitted to the atmosphere from these kind of natural systems. And we know that those volatile organic compounds create the secondary aerosols and the products that Matt was kind of talking about, and Tracy to some extent, which cause the smog and the kind of the irritation symptoms. So what I'll illustrate on that is here, which is a modelling exercise in the US, and you can see on your left-hand side there, this is a day in August the 18th, 2003, using global modelling techniques to look at the implications of wildfires and some of these environmental events in the US when it's been burning for an 18-day period in 2003. Okay, and so what you have here is this is what's happening in terms of the amount of organic aerosols, which are the things people worry about when there's a wildfire, which causes massive problems in terms of public health. If, however, we look at kind of the risk factors, this one here shows you the implications of that incident if we start including anthropogenic pollutants on top of that picture. Okay, so that's when you start getting the real complications, because this is a natural event based on non-anthropogenic emissions. okay, and the risk factors are quite low. However, as soon as you incorporate the effects of car pollutants and diesel and that on top of that, you can see the increase in risk of these organic aerosols, which are the things which give you the lung problems that we heard about earlier. And you can begin to see hotspots very much associated with densely populated US cities. Okay, so what you have here is a situation in which, although we have problems in terms of those vast amounts of carbon emissions that I spoke to you about, it's when that interacts with the diesel and the additional pollutants that we would get a major increase in the risks. And so what I hopefully have tried to do a little bit is to highlight why I think the interdisciplinary approach is a very, very good one for looking at this issue of atmospheric pollution and public health, because it's, as I've tried to show, and I think you would have picked up from the previous talks, we're dealing with a very, very complex system. And in that complex system, we have all sorts of trade-offs and multiple scenarios to deal with. We have the, if we were to say, right, we can't have underground stations anymore, how would you deal with that when there's billions of people reliant on it in commuting and the world economics and trade, etc., being affected? We can have decisions about whether to grow trees in cities to mop up particles, but at the same time, if we grew eucalyptus trees in certain parts of warm environments, that will actually increase smog rather than reduce it. And therefore, having people working from different disciplines and different understandings can enable you to kind of offer evidence-based policy decisions, which enable you to also to look at what the impacts may be. So you can begin to say, right, these are the types of tree that you'd need to grow to reduce the pollutant effect, but not contribute to it. And therefore, I think hopefully what you've got some understanding of is the approach that we're adopting in Southampton, the fact that people, all three of us, Tracy works with Matt, I work with Tracy, we kind of talk with one another, and we can begin to therefore work out powerful, robust and rigorous ways in which we consider how you might want to create the right atmosphere which is going to give you public health benefits in terms of by providing the right micronutrients from crops because you help protect bees, reducing exposure to the wrong types of particles by actually implementing things in undergrounds or perhaps growing the right types of tree. When there's wildfire events happening, producing huge amounts of volatiles into the atmosphere, regulating traffic movements so you don't escalate the risk in various cities. And I think what it illustrates you as well is that the simplistic view of saying, oh, I've got an answer to something and here is your one way of dealing with it, is that only when you understand the broader system and you work with a range of people can you begin to actually say, well, how do we manage this system and how do we maybe mitigate against a consequence that we might not have understood properly, but we should have understood before we perhaps implemented what we were going to do. Thank you.